Good evening. Thank you very much for the chance to do this presentation. We are talking about article submission and peer review in our workshop this afternoon. My name is Gareth. I think most of our colleagues listening to the presentation now know me and know what I'm doing and who I am and so on. We are talking this evening, and I know that the time's not good and we're going to renegotiate like the time for next week. That's cool. We're going to talk about editors and what editors at international journals expect from article submissions. We're going to talk about how to effectively academic papers to journals. So that involves writing cover letters, it involves selecting effective peer reviewers, and it involves getting your papers through that initial selection phase of article processing that we call the editorial triage phase. So that's the plan. That's what we're going to talk about. This is our workshop series. We are running 8 of these sessions, and then we are going to throw the floor open for colleagues to have the chance to talk about their own problems, issues, and any other questions that you may have had as a result of our series. So we're on number 4. We talked already about thinking about writing, about structure of academic papers. We talked about effective English for communication. We talked about journal selection in our last session, and today we're going to talk about submission and peer review. We'll then move on and talk about managing comments, revising papers after peer review, how to understand the impact of your research, and then we're going to talk about whatever anyone else in the group wants to discuss at the end of our sessions. Sorry about the Chinese characters on this slide. We are talking about the academic publishing cycle. So moving from that ideas phase through the funding stage, data collection, journal selection, which should happen ideally before paper writing in efficient academic publishing, paper writing, submission, which is our discussion today, and peer review and publication. And the point of this slide really is just to illustrate that this is an endless process. We keep doing it, we keep writing, we keep publishing, we keep going with the cycle, the academic publishing cycle. And I've shown you this slide already as well. It's important to understand at the outset of the publishing process the different kinds of people who will interact with your articles when those articles get submitted to international journals. So editor as a phrase, as a word in English, can actually mean a number of different kinds of people at the journal side of things. So you might interact with an editor who's managing the journal. You might interact with an academic editor who's going to be selecting what happens to your papers once you make that submission. So an editor who's selecting reviewers for your paper, or you might interact with a language editor. So somebody like me, for example, who work on the English editing. So be careful with the phrase editor in English, because it can actually refer to a number of different kinds of people in that journal publishing process. We look also in our last session at target journals, how to select a target journal for your work effectively. Of course, there's lots of different considerations that authors make when looking at which journals to submit their work to, but most of the time, people who are doing this effectively, it's recommended that you have a think about what target journal you're going to be submitting your paper to before you start that writing process, because the different journals, the different targets, for your work require you to write your papers in a different way. So if you were to send a paper to Nature or Science or a big international journal with a high impact factor and lots of multidisciplinary readers, you're going to have to write the paper in a different way to if you were writing for a local, more regional, subject area specific journal. So think about this, and it's important in the process to be efficient as an author, to reach out and talk to editors before you start to think about making submissions. So we recommend that you talk to editors, making pre-submission inquiries, writing emails to editors. Before you start to write the paper, send an email to the editor of maybe 5 or 6 different journals and ask those editors, would they be potentially interested in considering your work for publication? So that's a good way to kind of get ahead. That's a good way to speed up that journal selection process, talking to other people and making those pre-submission inquiries. So as we talked about last time, writing to editors can save a lot of time, can help you with the journal selection stage of the process, and have a look at the journals that international colleagues, other workers from around the world are using for their submissions. Who are the key people in your research field internationally, and which journals are they using for their submissions? So it's a good idea to come up with a list of key journals in your field. You can then select from those key journals when you make your own submissions, when you write your own papers. And we also then suggest that you're aiming high with your submissions, because your institution, your university is wanting you to get those submissions into journals with higher impact factors if possible. So there's no limit on the number of pre-submission inquiry emails that you can send to editors before you start the writing process, because you don't commit yourself to anything. So again, you've seen this before in our last presentation. Writing to editors is important. Writing to as many as you like helps you to select that target journal for your next paper effectively. And there's no problem at all to send the abstract, send the title of your paper off to journal editors before the submission and ask them, would they be interested in considering your paper for peer review? I can give you email templates that you can use for these kinds of inquiries in English. Here's one. Why not try it? You've nothing to lose. Why not write to a number of target journals before you think about even writing your paper? I always used to do this with my own papers. You have an idea, you have some results, you're thinking about writing up the paper, you think about where you might get that work published. You then write some pre-submission inquiry emails to editors, say, I have this result, I have this outcome, I have this idea. Would that be something that would be of interest to you, to your journal? Would that be something that you'd consider sending out for peer review? It can be a very effective strategy to up your effectiveness, your success rate with your publications. And the other thing to strongly consider doing is using preprint servers. We talked about these in our last session as well. Preprint servers are online repositories for academic work that can be used at any stage of the process before journal submission. Many journals are linked to preprint servers. Many researchers use preprint servers to get their work out there into the community, seen by other researchers in their field. Comments can be made, work can be shared fast with other researchers, peer review can even happen fast, and journals use preprint servers to select articles for their journals, for their publications. Editors look at preprint servers and they see what's out there in the field, in the area, places like the bioarchive, the chemical archive. The Chinese Academy has a number of preprint servers. There's PeerJ. Many journals link themselves to these preprint servers. So you piece of work, you can finish a draft of a paper and you can put that draft onto a preprint server. Other people will look at it, journal editors will look at it, peers in the field will comment on it, and peer review can happen. The journal article can get picked up by a journal much faster. People always say, what about my work? What about my intellectual property? What about my copyright? Don't worry, all of these preprint servers, they're protected by what are called Creative Commons licenses. So when you upload a piece of work to a preprint server, it gets assigned a Creative Commons, a CC license that protects your copyright. And so your work gets a document object identifier number, and then you can use that document object identifier number to make sure, and people have to cite your preprint in their own work. I'm sure that's something that we'll talk about in our question session at the end, but this enables you to gain full and open peer review of your work much more rapidly than you might do otherwise. So in the process, think about your journals before you start the writing process. Think about writing to editors before you start the writing process, making those pre-submission inquiries, and think about the use of preprint servers for your work. Our goal then, as authors submitting articles to international journals, is to make sure that they get through the triage stage. The triage stage in article processing is that initial stage at the journal where the editor, and I showed you some pictures of the different kinds of editors that you might encounter at journals, academic editors like me, like other colleagues who manage internationally, is the paper going to be interesting enough for our readership? Is it going to be worthwhile to send this paper out for peer review or not? That's the first stage of the process. That's why big journals like Nature and Science reject 9 out of 10 papers that get submitted. Editors are making initial decisions about whether the papers should be peer reviewed or not. So thinking about this with your submissions is very important at the outset. Does my paper fit with the journal aims and scope? Does my paper have a clear message? Is my paper original? Is it important? Is it true? Is it relevant to the readers of that journal? You have to sell your work to get your work successfully through the article triage process. High impact factor journals want to maintain high rates of rejection because rejection rate is part of the way that impact factor itself is calculated. And so for that reason, 9 out of 10 of those papers that get submitted to Nature and Science get rejected before peer review. So we have to do everything possible to make sure that our work gets through peer review. And sorry again for the Chinese characters on this slide. Maybe some of you can read Mandarin Chinese, but it's important to write a great cover letter when making your submission. That cover letter, that email that goes with your paper to the journal is critical. Don't be boring. Don't waste the opportunity to sell your work to the journal. Don't write something dull or boring. We get lots of letters that just say, please consider our paper for consideration in your esteemed journal, which is a waste of time. You have to tell the editor why they should take your work seriously. This is the worst kind. Lots of authors submit papers to international journals and they don't write a cover letter at all. They just expect us to be able to figure out what's going to happen next. They expect us to be experts in the subject. They expect us to be able to know what the next stage is going to be. Lots of authors also waste the opportunity by writing something boring, as you can see here. Dear editor, please find our paper enclosed, which we hope you will find interesting. Yours sincerely, Gareth. It's a wasted opportunity. You need something that captures the editor's attention with your submission, goes alongside your paper, tells them why the work is important. Here's one I made up, but it's a good example. This compound is a powerful anti-cancer agent, 99% yield. Reactions are 60% faster. Our method for protein synthesis gives 50% higher yields. Tell the editor why they should consider your paper for publication in the journal. And you also, in the cover letter, should put in suggestions for peer reviewers. This is critically important because editors are very busy working at journals. They don't often have the chance to know a lot about your subject area. They appreciate suggestions for peer reviewers, and often in the cover letter, they'll use those suggestions that you make when they're deciding who to send the paper out for peer review to. So you can make suggestions in the cover letter. You can put in the names of people who you know will be favorable towards the work, international colleagues that you've talked to about the paper, international colleagues who've helped you in the past with your research, international colleagues who are interested in your field. So this is all about maximizing your chances of success. This is one of the first sections of your paper that an editor's going to read. So the cover letter has to count. Ask yourself, why is your work important? Why is the result significant? What's the key result, the breakthrough? How is this an advance on previous work? Why are you submitting to this journal? Editors love it if you talk about their journal. You want to tell them why you've selected their particular journal for your research and tell them about some suggestions for peer reviewers. Here's a template. I'll give you some email templates at the end of this presentation that you can have a look at for using in your own submissions. We've already looked at one for pre-submission inquiries, for writing those emails to editors when you're thinking about which journal to select. Here's a template that you can have at the end of the webinar. I'll give you Word document templates. You can use this for your cover letter template when you're submitting a paper next to a journal. Here's, different bits that you can kind of cut out and keep, and bits you can fill in and reuse later, but you're telling the editor why the work is important, why you are considering it for their journal, which individuals would be suitable peer reviewers for that paper. So we move ourselves forward in the academic publishing cycle. Very, very important to do everything you can to make yourself a bit more successful, to get ahead of the competition, to speed up those article submissions. So the paper goes into the journal, the paper goes through the triage process, it gets selected by the editor as interesting enough to be sent out for peer review. It then goes out for peer review, and journals use different kinds of peer review. Peer review can either be completely open, single blind, or double blind, as it's called. So in completely open peer review, you and the reviewer know who each other are. In single blind peer review, the most common kind that journals use, you don't know who the reviewers are, but they know who you are. The reviewers remain anonymous, but the reviewers know the identity of the authors. Okay, that's the most common kind that journals use internationally. The other alternative is double blind, and that's where both you and the reviewer don't know who. Only the editor knows the identity of the authors and the reviewers. And that is often considered by many people, especially in developing countries, to be the most fair kind of peer review. But it's important before you even submit to a journal to have a think about this process, have a think about what kinds of review the journal is using. If you get a choice between single blind and double blind, which one will you pick as an author? Which one do you feel is going to be best for your paper? Peer reviewers, of course, are colleagues working in the same field, colleagues who've recently published. They may be selected by the editor using an automated online system, or they may be given as suggestions by you in your cover letter, as we talked about already. Peer reviewers are asked to comment critically on articles from a scientific perspective. They provide that cornerstone, that benchmark, that underpinning basis upon which we consider published material in the academic literature to be quality. Peer review is considered as the basis of academic publishing. So peer reviewers are looking at the content. They're not asked to look at the language, although they often do comment on the language. And so for that reason, it's important, as we talked about in our earlier sessions, to have a think about your English language before you submit to a journal. So editors get back comments from peer reviewers. They often communicate quite detailed comments back to editors that authors may not get to see. The comments that come back from the peer reviewers inform the editor's decision. And so it's very important, very, very important to think about what peer reviewers are doing. They often look at papers from a negative mindset. They often think, where's the problem? How can I find an issue with this paper? Often they think, how can I stop this paper from getting published? So if you know that most peer reviewers, unfortunately, are quite negative about papers, you can prepare yourself before submission. You can make sure your paper is as good as possible and as bulletproof as possible, especially in the methods section, because the methods section, that area where you talk about what you did, the data you collected and how you analyzed it, is the area where reviewers very often find issues with papers. The number one area where it did is in the methods section. So let's keep that in mind. People also often ask, how can I select peer reviewers? How can I know which international colleagues are good to choose, good to suggest to journals as potential peer reviewers? And remember, the journal editor might not use your suggestions, but they might use your suggestions. So always make peer review suggestions in your cover letter, even if you're not asked to. It often will be helpful to editors. Who can you suggest? People ask. Well, you have a network of international colleagues. Even if you don't call it that, even if you don't think of it as that, you know people around the world in your field. You have what we call a mentorship network. You do know people around the world in your own subject area. You can reach out to them. You can think, will they be suitable to review my paper? Senior colleagues, authors of other papers in your field. These can't be colleagues. They can't be students, and they can't be recent collaborators. Those are conflicts of interest. Building a mentorship network for your career, for your research papers, as a pool of people, a potential group of people that you can use as peer reviewers, is a great idea. Reach out to people, talk to them. Why not send people your abstracts, your summaries, initiate discussions, build a network as an academic? Especially this is important for young researchers getting started in academia. Talk to people, build a network, get on ResearchGate, get on academia.edu, get on some of those other academic social networking sites that international colleagues use, LinkedIn, Google Scholar, ORCID, all of these different places where you can build a profile and make sure that people know about you and know about your work. When the review comes back from the journal, you are going to get comments, you're going to get feedback on your work. We'll talk about this in more detail in our later presentations, but you are going to get back comments. Your work might get rejected. We'll talk about how you can deal with rejection effectively, but you are going to have to respond to comments that come back on your paper. How are you going to do that? How are you going to respond effectively? Make the editor and the peer reviewers feel good about their contribution to your work. We get lots of letters, lots of emails, lots of documents from authors that are rude, are negative, that say, the reviewer didn't understand my work. How can they say this about my work? There are good ways to respond to comments that come back on your papers, even if you don't agree. Thank the reviewer for their time. The reviewer has correctly pointed out. We acknowledge that. We concur with the reviewer. These are ways to start sentences in a positive way. Thank you for the valuable comment. This valuable insight is much appreciated. These comments significantly enhance the quality of our work. If an editor reads that, if a reviewer reads that, they think, I've made a valuable comment. I've made an insight. I've been appreciated. They feel good about your work. They're more likely to make a positive decision about your work when they have to comment on it again. So being negative, being aggressive, being down about these decisions, these comments is not a good strategy to make sure that your work gets accepted. Here's a real email that I actually got sent to the journal that I work at. Dear editor, who reviewed my paper? I need to know. The comments I've received are extremely unfair. Who wrote this? Please write me. We have to protect the identity of reviewers often in the process. This is why reviewers often opt for being blinded. They adopt for anonymous, to be able to be anonymous about work. This is why often journals want to use some kind of blind peer review. So let's check as authors what kind of peer review our journal's going to use. Think about which kind works best for you. Double blind, single blind, completely open. Consider using preprint servers and open peer review systems. Making comments in response to review comments is a technical process, but you can do it easily by just responding point by point to all of the comments that you get in review. Responding to all of them shows the editor that you've taken the process seriously. Being polite, being thorough, thanking the reviewers for their time is also always a good strategy. I will give you also template documents that you can use to make your responses to reviewers the next time that you have that to do when a document comes back from the peer review process, how to respond effectively. We have accepted almost all of the comments. The changes we have made to our paper are summarized in this letter. Clear on the revised version as track changes. You put information into your response documents that helps the editor to make a decision. There are also a number of things to think about as an author that you don't want to do in the manuscript publishing process. Here are some examples. One of the key things that we get often, and people try to do all the time, is adding authors to papers once they've been accepted. So a paper gets submitted, it's got 2 or 3 co-authors, it gets accepted for publication. We then get emails from authors saying, hello, thank you for reviewing my manuscript. I have some minor modifications and I've added 2 authors. They have contributed to my paper. That is not okay. It's not allowed. When you submit a paper to an international journal, you click a number of boxes in the submission system that confirm that all the authors to the work and that's the final number of authors that are going to be on the work. Any changes in articles to do with authorship after submission require permission and approval of all the authors on the paper. So if you submit a paper with Gareth, Dimitri, and Tatiana as authors to a journal, it gets accepted, and then you want to add 3 more people. That's not something that happens often. You have to get lots of paperwork completed. The permission of all the authors is going to be required. Journals hate having to deal with these kinds of situations. Trying to add authors after acceptance causes a lot of red flags, a lot of alarm at the editorial office. I will also say in this presentation that if you don't have an ORCID ID, I recommend that you get an ORCID ID as soon as you can, because these ORCID identification numbers, it's a not-for-profit charity, it's an organization that provides you with a unique identifying number. You go on the website, you sign up for an ORCID ID, it assembles your publication list from existing academic databases. This is a great system. You may have seen these little green identification numbers next to author names on published work. This is a identifier that distinguishes you from other researchers. It's great for finding people around the world. It's great for making yourself known around the world. Great idea, great thing to sign up for. For example, you know, in the UK, in England, there's lots of people called Smith. In China, there's lots of people called Zhang, you know, and if I want to search for a particular researcher and I just enter their last name and it's Smith, let's say, in terms of English people, it's going to be very hard for me to find that particular researcher, or Zhang in China, or Xing in China. So having an ID like this is very useful because it ties you to your research, it ties you to your institution, and it means that other international colleagues can find you quickly and identify your research. So all of this is about communication, being available to international colleagues, making sure that your research is known about and talked about. Hi, where's my paper? I've waited 2 months. Looking forward to an immediate reply is a bad email to send to a journal editor. They won't want to help you. Whereas if you write, "Dear editor, I'm writing to ask if I can do something to help speed up my recent submission. Can I make some suggestions for additional peer reviewers?" That's more helpful. That's more positive. That gives something to the editor. They're going to respond to you much more quickly. One of the keys to being successful in international research and publishing is communicating, talking to editors, reaching out before you write, reaching out as you write, talking to them in the cover letter, and coming back with comments on your papers once your papers get review comments back from journals. So we've talked today a little bit about what editors expect from submissions. We've talked a little bit about submitting those papers, how to write cover letters, being effective when you select reviewers, and how to get your paper through that editorial triage stage, how to get your paper through that process, maximize its chances of getting successfully selected by an editor for peer review. So thanks for listening. We now have time for questions, so I shall hand back to Tatiana, and thank you very much for listening. I know it's late on Friday. I'm sorry that we had to do it at this time today. Forgive me. I hope it was okay.
Thank you, Garrett. Great. Any questions, please, especially from young researchers? Maybe in Russian, in Kazakh, our helpers will translate.
Great, no questions.
No questions.
Awesome.
No
Everyone's
questions.
asleep. That's good. Okay, that's good.
Can I ask one question? I didn't got fully about the list of authors of paper. For example, if we, for example, forgot to include somebody, and at which step we can ask editor to make some considerations to editing the list of
yeah, I mean, it's an important question. I mean, why would you forget to add an author to a paper when you're about to submit it to a journal? I mean, this is authorship's one of the most important things to think about before you write a paper, and it's strongly recommended that you have a meeting with all of your colleagues who will be authors on your paper and discuss the structure of the paper, what the contents of the paper will be, and what the order of the authors is going to be before you start the work, because there's always conflict otherwise. People always argue otherwise. Like, I've been in lots of situations as an editor and also as an author where, you know, people are unhappy with their position on the paper as an author, or they're unhappy with the contents of the paper once it gets published. And these are really difficult situations to resolve. I mean, to give you some examples, like, you know, imagine that we have 6 authors on a paper and the paper gets accepted for publication in Nature. You know, people are then going to care a lot about whether they're the first author or not, and what their position on the paper is going to be. So if you don't resolve that before the submission, you're going to have a problem, because people are going to be like, I should be the first author, or I should be the last author. And it's a nightmare, really difficult to resolve these kinds of situations. I have one situation at the moment with Historical Biology, the journal that I'm editing, about it's a bunch of colleagues from here in Europe. They submitted a paper got accepted, paper got published, and now one of the authors is saying, I don't agree with the conclusions of this study. Take my name off the paper. How do you deal with that? How does the journal deal with that? It's very difficult and very expensive for journals to deal with that problem, because we have to get signed forms from all of the authors saying that they agree that this colleague can be removed. We then have to reset the paper, we have to republish the paper, and we have to publish a correction to the original paper. It's very, very difficult, very problematic. And so talk to people before you start to write. It's much, much easier to have a meeting and say, hey, we're all 4 of us going to be authors on this paper. I propose the following order, I propose the following structure, and then you can figure out these kinds of issues earlier rather than later. Hope that helps.
Yes, I ask because in some situations, for example, authors who contribute provide some samples,
Yeah.
or give some recommendations, or by contribute your paper. For example, at the beginning told that and just cite me or just give me some acknowledgements, it's enough. But after you submitting a paper to the journal, they changing by some reason their mind and saying that now put me to your paper. So this is why I'm asking.
It's very difficult, I know, especially if you're an early career young researcher. Like, this could be like somebody more senior than you. I mean, it's really tricky, I know. And of course, people will say, hey, like, you know, there's no need to make me an author on that paper. But once they see that it's going to be submitted to a big journal, like ISI listed journal or something, then of course they're going to come back and say, I should be an author. Like, but I mean, I would, yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Try to, I would say, you know, when you make these arrangements with people at the beginning of the process, you say, okay, I'm going to submit the paper to this journal. I'm going to submit it to this journal. Are you okay with just being in the acknowledgements? You have to be very clear with people, you know, and you have the chance to be an author. Are you sure that you don't want to be an author? You know, that kind of approach, because changing minds later causes problems, really causes problems. I mean,
yes, all right. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I also have a question. I am not very clear understand about peer review.
Yeah.
Does peer review affect on the result of publication? For example, if peer reviewer will not like, for example, or will not agree with some results, will the article accepted or published? How is it affect?
Okay, we need to talk about this in more detail in our next session, but peer review, basically, it's the so an editor will send the paper out to colleagues, and the colleagues, like international colleagues or other workers, like will make comments on your paper, and then the editor will look at those comments and make a decision about what should happen to the paper based on those comments. So the comments of the peer reviewers are important, and they have factor, they bear on what happens to the paper, but the editor will make a decision about whether you have to do something or you don't have to do something. Okay, but often, I mean, a peer reviewer will say, I need this additional work done or this additional analysis done, and that is often what you're going to have to do to get the work published in that journal. So they can be very, in many cases, very influential over the eventual outcome of that paper in that particular journal. So for that reason, it's important to try to make suggestions from your own experience about who would be good as a peer reviewer for your paper. And again, this is something that comes with more experience, like writing and publishing papers for sure. But yeah, I mean, dealing with comments, we'll talk about that next time, but it's very difficult sometimes if you get like somebody who's negative about your work, how you're going to deal with those comments. There's a trick to it though. Be positive, be polite, try to always do as much as possible out of the changes that you're being asked to make by the peer reviewers. If you do most of the changes, then you can get away with not doing some of the other changes, I would say.
Okay, it means that peer reviewers will not decide what will be the next.
The editor decides. The editor will decide what happens to the paper. Yes. So the peer reviewers can't themselves say this paper's not going to get published. No, the editor looks at the peer reviewers' comments and then makes a decision. So if you get unfairly treated by a peer reviewer, you can go back to the editor and talk to the editor about that situation.
Okay, thank you.
May I do some comments?
Yeah.
I think that recently a very good rule appeared for the papers, a special part about contributions of all authors. And if this description of authors' contributions will be done in true way, to real description,
yeah,
it will be really good creative group of authors. For example, now you know that now there are many papers with a huge number of authors, 30, 40, and most of them were just really collectors. And they are collected not a big number of samples, for example, for molecular genetic analysis, but just 1, 2 samples. But in this case, I think the place of these authors in the section acknowledgements, really.
Yeah,
and this description of contributions must be done very precisely.
Yep, that's a good point. Absolutely. Lots more journals are asking for this now. More and more journals are asking for this now. And in fact, this is one area of publishing where where it's very difficult to police this kind of thing. It's very difficult to control this kind of thing.
Yes. I would like to say about this.
Most international journals are members of what's called the Committee on Publishing Ethics, COPE. You can check it online. So big international journals, certainly all of the major publishing companies, all of the ISI listed journals, they have signed up to what's called the Committee on Publishing Ethics. And there are rules and guidelines that editors and authors are about who is an author on an academic paper. And the basic consideration, the basic building block is you have to make an intellectual contribution to the work in order to be an author. And the key word in that is intellectual contribution. So that's why journals ask for statements about what did you do, because just collecting a sample or just providing a sample or just allowing access to a facility, a lab or a machine, is not sufficient to be an author on a paper. But it happens all the time. People are saying all the time, if I give you this, then I want that, you know? So journals try to police it by getting you to write in your document what you did and who did what. And the biggest journals, the leading journals, the high impact factor journals have started to actually check, you know? It's a very difficult situation, and it's a very difficult area to control. There's lots of gray areas. For example, if I get a grant, if I win funding, let's say I get a big grant from the European Union, and I then spend that grant and I run a research project, should I be an author on the papers that result from that? Am I making an intellectual contribution? People would argue, well, yes, because you wrote the grant, you know, you won the funding, but you know, there's lots of situations where that may or may not be the case. I mean, you know, what about supervising students? What about that situation? Are you, as the professor, making an intellectual contribution to the PhD project or the master's project? I mean, it's on the person, it depends on the institution, it depends on the particular situation. Lots of students don't get much help from their supervisors. It's all very, very difficult to figure out. But, you know, fundamentally speaking, if you don't make an intellectual contribution, you shouldn't be an author. And I always used to say, like, I have a little kind of rule on this for myself, you know, and I've published some papers and done some collaborations over the years. And my kind of benchmark, my kind of rule of thumb on this was, could I stand up at an international conference? Could I go to an international conference and give a talk about that research? If the answer is yes, then you should be an author. If no, then you shouldn't. I mean, like, so in my case, like, I turned down papers, publications in the past because I was like, you know, I'm not sure that I know what this paper's about. I'm not sure that I could, you know, stand up at a conference and give a presentation about this or answer questions about this in an interview, you know? So I you know, but that was my kind of thing, you know?
You're right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
100%.
I had students, I was supervising students in the past where I had not much idea about what their PhD projects were on, because they were engineering students, they were physics. Some of the projects were very mathematical. Like, you know, I helped, I provided fossils, I gave access to, you know, laboratory facilities and stuff like that. But when it came to like writing up the papers, I was like, you know, put me in the acknowledgements because I don't understand the project, you know.
Yes, but we know some professors who is a mentor of PhD students, for example, but help in nothing things. But he decides that because he is mentor of the student, he must be not only one of the co-authors, but first co-authors.
Yeah, well, I hope.
It's very bad example.
I hope that that situation is changing internationally. I hope that that's becoming less and less common. It's because it's not fair to the students. Like, our responsibility is to the young generation of researchers, I think. So it's not, you know, I mean, and hey, like, you're a professor, you've published a bunch of papers. You don't need like another first authored paper, probably. I mean, but it's always a problem. We're dealing, for example, we're dealing with a situation in Belarus at the moment with a colleague of mine in Minsk. You know, there's a student and, you know, she can't get any of her work published because the professor won't sign off on any of the papers. So, you know, you have to switch to another university to get the work published. It's terrible sometimes, you know. Anyway.
Yeah. We'll hope that all these things will change soon and quickly.
But you're right, absolutely. Like these contribution statements that journals ask authors to make are very important, because that actually kind of focuses the mind. What did you actually do? What can you write? You know?
But the authors also must write it honestly.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's also a very important thing.
You can always say, I contributed to the manuscript. I contributed to the research, you know.
Okay, thank you. More questions? In Russian and Kazakh?
Did we make, hopefully we recorded this so we can put this up on the,
yes.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great.
Record is a record, but this our discussions has possibility to have the questions.
Yeah.
Okay. If we have no questions, we can thank Garrett.
Okay.
And we'll decide in closest days, I think, our next schedule. Okay?
Yeah, perfect. Any
day and time.
Any time is good, apart from 4 o'clock Kazakhstan time on Fridays, because
any day.
Any day.
Any day.
I can do any other day you like.
Alena, Dania.
Just remember that I'm 5 hours earlier than you. It's just 2 p.m. here in Hungary.
Maybe even Friday. Bayan? Yes, Friday at 4.
4 is okay for me. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Sunday at 7 a.m. No?
No, not no days off. So no weekend. Okay, thank you.
Good
so
weekend.
See you on Friday.
Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you very much. Have a nice.
Thank you, Alena, Dania.
Thank you so much.
All.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a nice
Enjoy
evening.
your weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.